Ben Turner's life was as predictable as the seasons in Willow Creek. A farmer for over 30 years, he knew the land as well as he knew his own heartbeat. Each morning before dawn, Ben would rise from his small weathered farmhouse, pull on his boots, and step into the chill morning air. The first sounds of the day were always the same, the low murmur of the wind through the trees and the distant calls of early birds. There was something comforting about the quiet. But there was also an emptiness, a solitude that seemed to grow with each passing year. His children had grown up, left for the city, and only returned for holidays. His wife, Mary, had passed away a few years back, leaving behind only the echo of her laughter in the walls of their home. In the silence, Ben found both peace and loneliness, an odd mix that seemed impossible to escape. His days were filled with work, plowing fields, tending crops, and caring for the animals. But at night, when the chores were done, the silence crept in like an unwelcome guest. On one particular morning, as Ben made his way to the barn to check on the livestock, something out of the ordinary caught his eye. At the edge of his property, near the fence line, there was movement. Ben squinted into the early light, trying to make out what it was. At first, he thought it might be a deer or perhaps a stray animal, but then he saw it clearly. A dog. An old German shepherd, thin and weathered, its coat matted with dirt and grime. It limped slowly across the field, as if every step caused it pain. Ben's heart tugged at the sight. He had always been a lover of animals, and the sight of the dog in such a state made something stir within him. Without thinking, he set down the bucket of feed he had been carrying and walked toward the dog. It didn't run away, but it didn't come closer either. The dog's eyes were fixed on him, and there was something haunting about the look it gave. Ben could almost feel the weight of years of hardship in those eyes. "Hey there, old fella," Ben said gently, crouching down. The dog didn't move, but it watched him with an unsettling intensity. Ben knew the dog was in bad shape. His instincts kicked in. "Come on, boy. Let's get you inside." He extended a hand slowly, and to his surprise, the dog let him get close. It seemed to know, or perhaps it simply didn't have the strength to fight back. Ben carefully took the dog by the collar and led it toward his house. He couldn't just leave it out here in the cold. Something about the dog seemed to call to him, a silent plea for help. Little did he know, this simple act of kindness would soon unravel a mystery far beyond his understanding. Ben carefully guided the old German shepherd into the warmth of his barn, where he had set up a small space for the dog to rest. The barn smelled faintly of hay and old wood, a comforting scent that felt like home. Max, Ben had decided to call him that after the dog's strong yet gentle nature, staggered a bit, clearly weak, but followed Ben's lead without resistance. Once inside, the dog collapsed onto the straw with a soft grunt, his breathing labored but steady. Ben went to work quickly. He fetched a towel, wetting it with warm water, and gently cleaned the dog's matted fur. The more he wiped, the more Ben saw the scars and weariness in the dog's body. The coat was thin, clinging to its ribs, and patches of fur had long since been lost to age and neglect. It was clear that Max had been on his own for some time. Despite his frailty, there was a quiet dignity in the dog's eyes. Max had been through something, Ben could tell, something that had marked him, physically and emotionally. Once Max was clean, Ben took a deep breath and surveyed the barn. He had been so focused on helping the dog that he hadn't even realized how quiet the farm had become. The usual sounds of the roosters crowing and the cows lowing seemed distant, almost drowned out by the presence of the dog. Ben sat on a nearby stool and watched him carefully. The dog's eyes, though tired, still held a spark of life, something that hadn't yet been extinguished. Ben wasn't one to get sentimental about animals, but there was something about Max that tugged at his heartstrings. Maybe it was the way the dog kept staring at him, as if assessing him, reading him in a way that only dogs could. It was as if Max was trying to decide if he could trust him, or if Ben was just another fleeting person who would disappear when the going got tough. Over the next few days, Ben kept a close eye on Max. He fed him small meals of stew and warm broth, hoping to help rebuild his strength. The dog seemed to appreciate the food, though he ate slowly, his movements cautious and deliberate. He was, Ben thought, like a person who had been through too much to trust anyone easily. Each time Ben approached, Max watched him with those same wary eyes. There were moments when the dog would let out a low, mournful whine, as if remembering something, or someone. Ben couldn't even begin to understand. Yet, with each passing day, Max began to respond more. His steps became less stiff. His tail, though still slow, would wag when Ben came near. And for the first time in a long while, Ben felt something shift inside of him. It wasn't just the satisfaction of helping an animal in need. It was the quiet understanding that Max was no ordinary dog. There was a depth to him, a history that Ben could only begin to guess. It wasn't just a dog he had. As the days passed, Ben found himself becoming more attuned to Max's habits. The dog was recovering, yes, but there was something deeply unsettling about him at times. It wasn't just the way Max would stare into space, as if seeing something Ben couldn't. It was the small things, the odd, inexplicable behaviors that started to surface. Max would often disappear into the fields at night, vanishing without a sound. At first, Ben thought nothing of it, assuming the dog was simply wandering the farm as dogs sometimes do. But it wasn't just the absence that bothered him. It was the silence. Max would slip away under the cover of darkness, and Ben would hear nothing at all. No bark, no rustling of leaves, no footsteps. It was as if the dog had learned to move without a trace, a skill so quiet it was almost unnatural. One evening, after a long day of work, Ben sat on his porch, watching the sky turn pink with the setting sun. The cool breeze was a welcome relief from the heat of the day. But as the shadows lengthened, Max suddenly appeared at his side, looking up at him with those intense, knowing eyes. It was almost as if the dog was waiting for something, waiting for Ben to acknowledge him. "Where have you been?" Ben muttered, reaching down to scratch Max behind the ears. The dog tilted his head but didn't respond. Instead, he turned his gaze to the barn, his ears twitching at the faintest sound. Ben followed his stare, but the barn was still. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary. Max whined softly, a low, almost mournful sound. Over the next few nights, this behavior became more frequent. Max would return from the fields covered in dirt and grime, his coat matted as if he had rolled in something. The first time it happened, Ben had assumed the dog had gotten into the mud while exploring. But when it happened again, and then again, he began to wonder. There was no mud on the farm that could explain how Max had gotten so dirty. It was as though the dog was being drawn to something out in the fields, something Ben couldn't see, but that Max seemed to understand. Ben also noticed how Max would stand rigidly by the barn at odd hours of the night, his body tense, eyes fixed on an invisible spot in the distance. At first, Ben thought he might be imagining things, but it happened so consistently that it soon became impossible to ignore. The dog would stand guard for hours, never moving, never blinking, as if waiting for something. Something Ben could not comprehend. Max's behavior was starting to unsettle Ben. He had seen dogs act in strange ways before, but this was different. There was an intelligence in Max's eyes, a depth of awareness that went beyond simple instincts. The dog seemed to know things that Ben couldn't begin to understand. One night, after Max had once again vanished into the fields, Ben stood by the barn, watching the dark horizon. He could feel the weight of the dog's gaze upon him. Even though Max wasn't there, it was as if Max was trying to tell him something important, something that Ben wasn't yet ready to hear. The night was thick with fog, and the air smelled of earth and rain. Ben had just finished his chores and was about to head inside when he noticed that Max was nowhere to be found. It wasn't unusual for the dog to go off on his own, but tonight there was something different. Ben's gut twisted with unease, a feeling he couldn't shake. The fields lay silent, bathed in the faint glow of the moon, and the usual night sounds of crickets and owls seemed eerily absent. Ben stood still, listening. The only sound was the wind, rustling through the trees in the distance. He called out softly, "Max." His voice seemed to disappear into the fog. There was no answer, not even the sound of paws on the ground. His heart skipped a beat, and an inexplicable sense of dread settled over him. He knew he had to find the dog. Without thinking, Ben grabbed a flashlight from the shed and made his way toward the fields. The beam of light cut through the fog, illuminating the ground ahead of him. He called again, but Max didn't respond. The farther Ben walked, the colder the air seemed to get. It was as if the night itself was holding its breath, waiting. The flashlight beam finally landed on something. Movement in the distance. Ben's pulse quickened as he squinted into the darkness. There, just beyond the edge of the property line, he saw Max. The dog was standing motionless, staring intently at something in the distance. His fur was ruffled, and his body was tense, like a coiled spring. Ben called to him again, but Max didn't budge. It was as if the dog couldn't hear him at all. Ben's footsteps quickened, and he hurried toward the dog. But with each step, the ground seemed to grow softer, the air heavier. As he neared Max, the dog's head snapped around, and his eyes locked onto Ben's with an intensity that made his skin crawl. For the first time since he had rescued Max, Ben felt a chill run down his spine. There was something in those eyes, something far deeper than simple instinct or hunger. "Max, come on," Ben said, his voice shaking slightly. But the dog didn't move. Instead, Max gave a low growl, a sound that was more warning than anything else. Ben hesitated, unsure of what to do. The hairs on the back of his neck stood on end. Then, without warning, Max darted off into the fog, vanishing as quickly as he had appeared. Ben stood frozen for a moment, unsure of whether he should follow or head back to the barn. But before he could make up his mind, he heard a rustling from behind the barn. Max was back. But this time, the dog wasn't alone. There was something else out there, hidden in the mist. Ben's heart raced as Max returned from the fog, his eyes wide with something like recognition, or perhaps warning. The dog's once guarded demeanor had shifted. Now, he seemed more like a creature on high alert, driven by a purpose Ben couldn't understand. Max walked directly to the barn, not stopping to acknowledge Ben's presence. It was as if the dog knew exactly where he needed to go. "Max," Ben called, his voice soft yet edged with urgency. He hurried to catch up with the dog, but Max had already stopped at the back of the barn, his body tense, his nose pressed to the cold ground. Ben could feel the atmosphere change, the air thickening with the same strange energy that had filled the fields earlier. Something was hidden here, something important, and Max seemed determined to find it. Ben knelt down beside Max, shining his flashlight along the barn's exterior. The beam landed on a patch of dirt that looked out of place. It was disturbed, as if something had been recently moved. Ben's pulse quickened. With his heart pounding, he dug into the soft earth with his hands, uncovering what appeared to be a rusted metal box. It was small, no bigger than a shoebox, but it was buried deep, and its edges were sharp with age. Max barked once, a short, sharp sound, as if urging Ben to open it. With trembling fingers, Ben pried the box from the earth, its lid creaking as he lifted it open. The faint smell of old paper and dust hit him instantly. Inside, there were yellow documents, brittle with age, and several photographs that had been carefully wrapped in cloth. Ben carefully pulled them out, his hands shaking slightly as he examined the contents. The first photograph was of a group of men in military uniforms, standing in front of what looked like a small, nondescript building. The image was faded, but there was something about it that felt significant. A few of the men held weapons, while others were posed with serious expressions, their faces worn and weathered by time. Beneath the photograph, in tiny, faded writing, was the date, 1942. Ben's mind raced. This was no ordinary farm relic. He carefully sifted through the other papers, which seemed to be a mix of handwritten notes and more photographs. But one piece of paper caught his eye. A sealed envelope, marked with a symbol Ben didn't recognize. The symbol was old, almost like a code. He couldn't make out the words, but there was something urgent in the way it had been sealed. Max, standing by Ben's side, let out a low growl, and Ben felt a chill spread through him. The dog's eyes were fixed on the envelope, as though it knew exactly what was inside. Ben's hands trembled as he gently opened the seal. The contents of the envelope, a series of cryptic, coded messages, were written in a language Ben didn't recognize. But one thing was clear. Someone had gone to great lengths to hide these documents, and Max had been guarding them all along. The weight of the discovery settled over Ben like a heavy cloud. There was something here, something much bigger than he could have ever imagined, and Max had been waiting for him to find it. Ben sat in stunned silence, the envelope still in his hands. The rain outside had picked up again, drumming against the barn's tin roof like a soft, constant reminder of the world outside. But inside, Ben's focus was entirely on the papers in front of him. His mind raced, trying to piece together what he had just uncovered. Who were the men in the photograph? What was the purpose of the cryptic messages? And most importantly, why had Max been guarding this box? Max, standing nearby, seemed unusually still, his eyes never leaving Ben. The dog's posture had changed since the discovery. He no longer appeared anxious or restless. Instead, he was calm, almost expectant, as if he were waiting for Ben to understand something, to unlock the next piece of the puzzle. Ben gently set the envelope down and began sorting through the rest of the documents. The more he read, the more it became clear that the land where his farm now stood had been part of something much larger during World War I. The men in the photograph weren't just soldiers. They were members of a covert operation, possibly related to espionage or underground resistance efforts. The more Ben examined the documents, the more the pieces seemed to fall into place. These men had been part of something hidden from history, something no one had ever known about, except for Max. A chill ran down Ben's spine. It was becoming increasingly apparent that the dog hadn't just been a guard dog. He had been a sentinel, a protector of secrets. Max had been trained to find this box, to ensure it was never lost, never forgotten. It was as if the dog had been waiting for Ben to discover the truth, to uncover the history that had been buried here for so long. One particular document caught Ben's eye. It was a faded map of the region, marked with symbols that seemed to correspond to locations on Ben's own land. As he traced the markings with his finger, something in the back of his mind clicked. The symbols matched up with the places Max had always been drawn to: the fields, the barn, the spot by the fence line where Ben had first found him. It was as though Max had known exactly where the secrets were hidden all along, guided by some ancient instinct or training. Ben's thoughts swirled in confusion and awe. What had happened on his farm all those years ago? Why had this operation been so carefully concealed? And why had Max been so determined to lead him to these discoveries? The more questions he asked, the less he felt he understood. Max seemed to sense Ben's unease, stepping closer and nudging him with his head, as if offering silent reassurance. Ben smiled faintly, grateful for the dog's presence, though the weight of the discovery was heavy on his shoulders. There was more to this story, much more, and he knew he couldn't stop until he understood the full picture. But as he stared down at the map, one thing was certain: Max wasn't just a rescue dog. He was part of a legacy, a protector of a hidden history that had been buried for decades. And Ben had just become a part of that story. The night grew darker, and the sound of the rain intensified, as if nature itself were pressing in on Ben, urging him to act. His hands, still trembling, clutched the map and the documents as he stared at the symbols. The locations marked on the map were so precise, so deliberate. Ben's thoughts raced. He had always thought of his farm as just a patch of land, his family's home for generations, but now it felt like something much more. The symbols on the map seemed to correlate with areas he had always known, yet never fully understood. Max, as if sensing Ben's growing anxiety, moved closer and sat beside him, his large head resting on Ben's knee. The dog's eyes were calm, but there was an intensity in them that Ben couldn't ignore. It was as if Max understood the weight of the history they were uncovering together. "All right, Max," Ben whispered, more to himself than to the dog. "Let's see what they were hiding." Ben knew he couldn't ignore the connection between the symbols on the map and the strange spots Max had always been drawn to. With renewed determination, he decided to start his search at the first marked location, the old tree near the edge of the property. It was a spot that had always felt significant, though Ben had never quite understood why. It stood apart from the rest of the land, tall, twisted, and ancient, with roots that seemed to dig deep into the earth. Max seemed to understand what Ben was thinking. The dog stood up, his eyes never leaving Ben as he moved toward the barn's door. Ben followed, grabbing a flashlight and heading out into the stormy night, his boots crunching against the wet ground. The air was thick with moisture, and the wind howled, but there was a strange sense of urgency now, an almost magnetic pull to the place he had avoided for years. When they reached the tree, Ben's breath caught in his throat. The symbols on the map matched exactly with a series of small carvings on the trunk of the tree, etched into the bark so faintly that Ben had never noticed them before. The markings seemed to form a pattern, and as he traced them with his fingers, the air around him seemed to hum, as if the tree itself were alive, holding the key to something far older than he could comprehend. Max growled low, his ears standing up straight, his body tense. Ben looked around, suddenly aware that they weren't alone. The wind had died down, and in the eerie stillness of the night, Ben felt a presence, one that was unmistakably real, but also otherworldly. Before he could make sense of what he was feeling, the ground beneath the tree shifted. Ben's heart leaped as he realized that something was buried there, something that had been hidden for decades, waiting to be unearthed. Max stepped forward, nudging the soil with his snout, as if he too knew that this was the moment they had been waiting for. Ben dropped to his knees, his hand scraping at the earth, and soon he uncovered a small weathered box, much like the one he had found near the barn. It was covered in strange markings, and as his fingers brushed over it, he felt a chill run through him. This was no ordinary box. This was the key to everything. As he lifted it from the ground, Ben realized with a sinking feeling that the mystery was only deepening. And Max, the silent protector, had always known this was coming. Ben's hand shook as he held the small weathered box, its surface carved with the same strange symbols that had appeared on the map and the tree. Max stood by his side, watching him with a mixture of calm and urgency, his gaze never leaving the box. The storm had stopped, leaving an eerie quiet in its wake. The night felt charged, as though the very earth beneath Ben's feet was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. With a deep breath, Ben examined the box. There was no visible lock, no clasp. It seemed deceptively simple, just an old, unassuming wooden box. But Ben knew better now. Nothing about this was simple. He ran his fingers along the edges, searching for a way in. And then, with a faint click, a hidden compartment on the side of the box popped open. Inside, there was a small, folded piece of paper. Max gave a low whine, as if urging Ben to hurry. Ben's heart pounded as he unfolded the paper, revealing a series of neatly written instructions in a language he couldn't understand. At the bottom of the page, however, was something that made Ben freeze, a symbol, unmistakably familiar. It was the same symbol that had been on the envelope Max had guarded so closely, the same symbol that had been part of the covert military operation during World War II. Ben's mind raced as he traced the symbol. There were no words, only this single image, a sigil of some kind. It was as though the symbol itself was a key to understanding everything that had happened on this land. He looked at Max, who had moved to stand beside him, his large eyes fixed on the paper. "Max, "What does this mean?" Ben whispered, but the dog didn't respond. Instead, Max turned and walked toward the barn, stopping at the entrance and looking back at Ben, his gaze intense. Ben followed, still holding the paper tightly in his hand. As he entered the barn, he felt an overwhelming sense of déjà vu, as though the barn had always been the center of the mystery. He moved toward the far corner where the shadows lingered, his flashlight beam flicking across the wooden beams and crates. Then something caught his eye, an old hidden trapdoor beneath a stack of hay. Max sat down nearby, his gaze unwavering, as if telling Ben that this was where the next part of the story was to unfold. Ben knelt, his hands working quickly to clear away the hay. He pried open the trapdoor, revealing a dark, narrow staircase that led deep beneath the barn. With one last look at Max, who now seemed like a guardian more than a dog, Ben descended into the darkness. As his feet touched the bottom, he found himself in a small underground chamber, its walls lined with old documents, maps, and photographs, pieces of history long buried. And at the center of it all, a single object, an ancient journal, the final piece of the puzzle. Max had led him here, step by step, and now the truth was within reach.